couple of preliminaries. We will continue to keep the materials out on the other side of the wall so that after we're through tonight, if some who have come a little bit late have not had a chance to move about, you will have that opportunity. And then just one other word of explanation in relationship to persons who had anticipated being a part of our evening. With the decision that was rendered by Judge Nickel and the additional time that was made available to some of the attorneys, as well as to Dennis and Russell, a great deal of activity has been going on in lieu of trying to raise some funds to continue what obviously is going to be a very long and complex and important trial. And we're not precisely sure who all is going to be here. We do know that Bill Kunstler is not going to be here, nor is Mark Lane. But nevertheless, we're pleased that you have come and that we can share with each other. We'll share with those who are here and make this an evening that is important to all of us. I'd like to call on Dr. Paul Sonic, who is a part of the faculty at Luther Seminary. And Paul was the moderator at our first forum together, the middle of January, just prior to the time that Dr. Paul Bowe was ordered to report to the marshals in Sioux Falls. It was a very moving evening. A number of you who I see here were together on that particular evening. And Paul has agreed to thread through the night. And we'll just begin and kind of move along through the evening.
On behalf of the Why Wounded Knee Coordination and Information Committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this open forum meeting here this evening. We hope that the session here tonight will bring all of us up to date on important developments with respect to the situation of our Indian friends and brothers since our previous meeting in this hall. We shall have opportunity tonight to listen to several persons who know from firsthand experience what is going on. We've asked them that they keep their presentations relatively brief and to the point, so there will be ample opportunity for open dialogue and discussion. The point is that we do want you to have the chance to raise your own questions and make your own comments by addressing yourself to the issues raised by any or all of our speakers. Now, we've tried to facilitate this matter by placing microphones at various points in the hall. There's one over to my left, one here in the center, and another over to the far right, to my far right. And we like to use these microphones in a kind of Charlie McCarthy dock arrangement. We ask that when you want to address your questions or make your comments, you simply come down right in the middle of a speech if you want to, and come to one of the microphones, and I'll do my best to recognize you when you appear and try to facilitate the communication. Now, I know that from past experience, some of you probably have speeches that you're just longing to deliver. And it might well be that it would be good for all of us to hear your speech, but not tonight. If there are statements you feel you must make, okay, but keep them brief and to the point, and try to focus them on particular issues. If I find it necessary to interrupt you, please understand that my intention is not to put you down, but simply to function in such a manner as best to fulfill the purpose of our meeting together. But I do want to urge you not to hesitate about bringing your own questions and concerns to the fore, for that finally is what the meeting is all about. Well, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to spend a couple of hours together in open and fruitful discussion about fundamental issues that are as important as any which have to be faced in our nation today. Now, a lot of things have been happening with Paul Bowles since the last time he was here and met with us together. And I'm going to call on him now to get the evening started. Will you listen to him with great care and interest, and then respond to him by raising your comments and questions? Paul?
Thank you, Paul, and friends, it's just great to be here with you. I am remembering now, this evening, with a great deal of emotion, the meeting we had here on January 14th. Many of you were here at that meeting. You may remember the high emotion with which I approached this meeting and with which many of you approached this meeting. You may remember that Dennis Banks and Clyde Belcourt were here to speak, that Gladys Bissonette spoke, that we had the drums, the Indian drums here, and that many of you who were in the audience spoke at that time. It was a highly emotional time for me because I was anticipating going to prison. And this was, in a sense, a farewell and also a beginning. But it was a deeply emotional and deeply moving time for me. And although I greatly enjoyed it, at the same time, I can tell you that my stomach was jumping with the thought of facing imprisonment 2 days later. So I'm looking back tonight and thinking about that meeting and thinking about the things that have happened since that time. Now, I'm a little nonplussed at this point as to just how to proceed, because we had planned at the beginning of this meeting that we would give some rather short statements, that Dennis Banks would be here and perhaps one of the attorneys, and then we would open it up for some questions and discussion and some dialogue with the audience. At this point, Dennis is not here. He may be showing up through the door at any time. I certainly hope so. But anyway, Dennis is not here at this point. And neither are the attorneys here. So I'm a little nonplussed as to whether I should go on with my more brief remarks or whether I should have to keep talking until we've filled up that much time. I don't think I ought to do that. Do you, Paul? No, he says. I'm used to having people say, yes, speak on, speak on. Can't you be a little more positive?
Why don't you say what you got to say, and then let
okay.
the stuff come.
Very good. Okay. All right. This evening is labeled an update. An update as to what the issues are now with Indian people. An update since the last time we were together when I was facing prison, and something about what I have been doing since that time. An update on what a lot of people have been doing here in the Twin Cities and around the country to work for freedom and justice for oppressed people. An update on what some of the plans and prospects are for the future. So let's just make it an update at this point and begin to talk about where it's been, where it's at now, and what it might look toward the future. First of all, let me say, thankfully, that on January 16th, when I was ordered to prison, I did go to the U.S. Marshal's office in Sioux Falls. That had been a highly emotional day for me. I was
met at the airport by several hundred people who helped me depart with prayers and songs and the wonderful fellowship of their presence. I know many of you were present at the airport that morning. And President Preuss and my pastor and Paul Sonic and a number of other people accompanied Corolla and me to Sioux Falls. As you probably know, just shortly before the time I was to report to the U.S. Marshal, the word came from the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals that the decision had been reversed. It was reversed on a technicality. The technicality being that the court had not given time for my attorneys to prepare a proper defense, and it was remanded back to the court for further action. At this juncture, I should say that no further action has been taken. I still feel as though I'm being suspended by a thread. One of the pastors out in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a few weeks ago wrote to the Justice Department and asked them what the status of my case was. And the Justice Department wrote back saying, since this case is subject to further litigation, we are making no comments. So I really do not know what my personal situation is at this point. As time goes by, however, it seems less and less likely that I am going to be called back into court on that issue again. That is where it's at as far as I personally am concerned. Now, what has happened as far as the issues are concerned? I'm not going to go into this very much because this is the kind of thing that Dennis Banks is supposed to be talking about, but I'd like to just say a few things about what was said back in January and point out where it's at the present time. Those of you who were here in January may remember that I stated at that time that I had sensed that there were three issues facing all of us in this country. Not issues facing Indian people, but issues facing all of us. And I believe that the same three issues are facing us today. And they are namely these. First of all, what are we going to do in our country about the broken promises to Indian people, namely the treaties? What are we going to do about 300 contracts made with Indian people over the years, most of which have been either bent or broken in favor of white people? How are we going to deal with these? Let me give you a few examples. 2 weeks ago, I was out in Bellingham, Washington, which is up toward the north part of the Puget Sound area. There, the Lummi tribe is located. The Lummi tribe specializes in fishing. I was also down in Tacoma a few weeks before that and met with some of the Indians from Frank's Landing, which is down on the river and which also is a high fishing point for Indian people on the West Coast. The federal judge, in a court suit about 3 weeks ago, or about 2 months ago rather, ruled that the Indian people, according to the treaty, were entitled to 1/3 of the catch of salmon allowed in the whole Puget Sound area. 3 million salmon are permitted to be caught annually in the Puget Sound area. 1/2 of these may be taken by Indian people. Now, there was a great furor out in the Puget Sound area. When I was in Bellingham, I read in the newspaper that white fishing groups, both commercial and pleasure groups, were raising a kitty of $125,000 as a starter to, first of all, protest the judge's decision, and secondly, to help bring this to a higher court of appeal and ultimately to the Supreme Court. So the judge's decision is going to be stalled while an appeal is being made. You can imagine what it's going to cost the Indian people then to try to bring this kind of an appeal through an appeals court and then through the Supreme Court. It's one of the kinds of tactics that is being used even in the face of court decisions to again break or overturn decisions about treaties. This process is and has been going on throughout the country, as there is accelerated interest and concern about the treaties in various places throughout the land. One of the places it's a big issue is in Montana, where strip mining is being planned. The Peabody Coal Company is leasing Indian lands through the BIA. According to plans, strip mining is going to go on with really no plan. If you looked in the Minneapolis paper a few weeks ago, you'll know that the Environmental Protection Agency has loosened its requirements on strip mining, which means that not only will the land be strip mined, but it will not be restored to its previous condition. So the first issue remains the same. What are we going to do about the treaties? And this is an issue facing every American person, because it's our government and our people who have engaged in this process of continually bending or breaking treaties. The second issue, which we spoke about then and which is an issue today, is the governing system for Indian people, namely the Bureau of Indian Affairs and all of the other systems that go with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You may remember that one of the big issues at Wounded Knee itself was the BIA, the tribal government system administered by the BIA, and all the rest of the systems that deal with Indian people. It should be noted that now, more than a year after the beginning of the event at Wounded Knee, very little has changed in the systems that govern Indian people. Very little has been done to create meaningful self-government for Indian people. Very little has been done to make more meaningful the health system, the housing system, the educational system, all of these things run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So that remains as one of the burning issues. The third issue we talked about in January was that of justice, police power and justice in the courts. Having been around the country and listened to Indian people talking, and having looked at the newspapers, I am painfully aware that the justice system and the police power system is as oppressive today for Indian people as it was at that time. So, I believe the issues remain the same. And that's kind of a sad thing to say, isn't it? Because with all of the national publicity that has come to Wounded Knee, and all of the examination that has been done by speakers, by newspapers, by television accounts, by books written, and all of the other things, we have made very little progress in beginning to deal with the issues coming out of that tragic event. And so, on an update, as we look several months later at where it's at, we have to say to you that the issues are pretty much the same. All right, secondly, updating. Many of you have shown a personal interest in me. Many of you have asked, what have you been doing? Where have you been? How has it been with you? And I'd like to tell you a little bit about that at this time. There he is. Dennis, it's you they're applauding for, not Ham. Sit down over by Paul. I'll give you a little update as to where I have been. First of all, following the court action in January, I immediately received a tremendous flood of invitations to go around the country and to speak. And so for the last 3 months, I have been traveling almost all of the time, talking with groups of people about the Wounded Knee event, about the issues facing American people, and trying to answer some of the questions that people ask. In the last 3 months, I have spoken more than 100 times, sometimes together with Wounded Knee defendants or their attorneys, and sometimes on my own, frequently with Indian people from local areas. I started off speaking in Madison, Chicago, Milwaukee, throughout the Midwest. Then I went on a trip out to the East Coast, to Baltimore and Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C. Then to the West Coast, to Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, San Francisco, then to the Denver area, then back to the West Coast again, and then throughout the Middle West. There has been a tremendous eagerness on the part of people to talk about the Wounded Knee event and its meaning. I have just been overwhelmed to know that people throughout the country are so eager not only to turn out in large numbers, but to talk about it, to talk about the meaning of the Wounded Knee event, to probe their own responsibility for it and their own responsibility in it, and to discuss the issues raised by it. At several points on the West Coast, it was necessary to move from the auditorium or the room where the meeting had been scheduled to a larger one so that the crowds could be accommodated. This is not merely because of my own personal involvement here, but it's because people have earnestly sought to find out, what is this all about? What does it mean for our country? And what can be done? This has been just a thrilling thing. I have spoken at almost every conceivable kind of group. For example, I spent 6 days in the Bellingham, Washington area. I spoke to classes at the university. I spoke to open forums. I spoke to women's Bible studies. I spoke to the Lions Club. I spoke to the YWCA. I spoke to the Campus Christian Ministry Group. I spoke at a midweek Lenten service. I spoke at an ecumenical service in a Catholic church, just in one area of the northern part of Washington. This is the way it has been. There have been numerous television appearances. There have been numerous appearances on talk shows answering questions. There have been many articles in the newspapers, which only shows that there is a deep interest and concern, not just here in the Twin Cities where the trials are and where people can see the defendants and their attorneys, and we get daily reports in the newspaper, but in areas like Bellingham, Washington, and places like this all around the country, where Wounded Knee appears in the newspaper maybe once in a month. And yet people have sensed the significance of this event. The other interesting thing is that at these events, people want to ask questions. As an example, last night I was in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. About 200 people turned out. The meeting started at 7:30. At 10:15, we finally had to close it off, and there were still half a dozen people waving their arms and saying, hey, we want to ask more questions. Because people want to probe into what are the issues. And it's very fascinating that ultimately, instead of just talking about Indian people and what Indian people are concerned about and the trials, ultimately these discussions turn on the questions of oppression and justice and freedom for all people. we begin, all of us, to realize that systems trap all of us, and that we're all a part of creating systems and being trapped by systems. And the Wounded Knee event has served to bring that, I think, before all of our people. So that's what I've been up to since we appeared together here last time. Now, finally, a lot of people have asked me what my plans are for the future. First of all, let me say that Westwood Church, my home congregation, voted last week to issue me a call to a ministry at large, which enables me to remain within the ministry of the American Lutheran Church, but which frees me to move about freely in a rather broad kind of ministry, which has been described as standing alongside Indian people. I have three things in mind at the present time. First of all, I have a number of speaking commitments to fulfill between now and the first week in June. Secondly, I hope to spend some time with Indian people this summer. I've been invited to the Standing Rock Reservation, where the AIM Convention is going to be held the first part of June, and where there will be a convocation on the treaties, at which Indian people hope that a large number of leadership people in our country will be present to talk about this pressing issue. Then I would hope to spend some time going to places where there are burning issues to be looked at. For example, I would like to go to Montana and look into the whole strip mining business, to talk to the people who are planning the strip mining, to talk to some of the Indians to see how this is going to affect them. I would like to go to Washington to look into this whole matter of fishing rights and talk to some of the fishing people who see the the court order for Indians as a threat to them, and then talk to the Indians to find out how this affects their lives. This is the kind of thing I would like to do this summer. I had a little talk to Dennis Banks the other day about this. Dennis kind of was rather quiet and non-committal when I said I would like to visit some Indian reservations. And finally he kind of shook his head and he said, "Well, Paul, I hope you don't become an Indian expert. I hope you don't spend a few weeks on Indian reservations and then come home and write a book all about Indians. I hope you don't spend a few weeks on Indian reservations and then go around to begin to speak for Indian people." And Dennis, thanks for saying that. I think that was a good word. And I'm keeping that in mind as I'm looking forward to the planning for this summer. Secondly, this fall, a number of areas where we have visited have asked whether there could not be workshops conducted. Workshops for congregations and community groups who would like to begin to work in their own communities and wherever possible on national issues, but largely in their own communities, to bring about the kind of change that is necessary, not only to bring about change with Indian people, but also to bring about change in all kinds of oppressive systems for people in their own areas. Thirdly, I have been asked by at least one college to do some teaching at an interim during the month of January. So that's kind of the way things have shaped up for the future. Now I want to say that some other thrilling things have happened, and I just want to mention them because you will hear more about them. One of the things that happened after the event in January was the formation of the Why Wounded Knee Committee. That really has been a thrilling thing for me. A group of volunteer people who have undertaken to give themselves, their time, their energy, their thought, and their money to trying to bring about some necessary changes and to bring about some necessary helps for Indian people. Secondly, many of you have been the recipients of a good deal of literature. That has been planned by the Why Wounded Knee Committee, but largely executed by Ham and Pearl Moose and some people who have worked very closely with them. And I want to express my deep personal thanks to Ham and Pearl Moose, and also to members of the Why Wounded Knee Committee and the hundreds of other people who have given themselves and their time and energy for these causes. So, with that, I'm going to sit down at this point, and you feel free to ask any questions you want at a later moment.
Now, how do you want to proceed? Are there some questions for Paul Bowe right now? Okay, we'll proceed. I want you to know that Dennis Banks flew all the way from Los Angeles just to be with us here tonight. And he's got to get on a plane again at 10 o'clock to go back to Los Angeles. Now, I think that's nice. So, Dennis, we're just proud that you're here tonight. We're very, very grateful to you for making this display of energy and devotion, and we look forward very much to having you address us now. Dennis Banks.
I'll be very brief so that I've learned from the attorneys, if you're very brief, only the questions can fall within whatever I talk about. I want to make 2 or 3 announcements. The other one of them is we've announced this before to the press, but it hasn't received too much publicity across the country. So every place we go, we're making this a point. The treaty conference that Paul mentioned, the first treaty conference, and on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. The press release reads as follows. The American Indian Movement and the Standing Rock Sioux Tribal Council of the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in South Dakota have jointly agreed to sponsor the first Great Sioux Nation Treaty Conference. This historic meeting will take place June 8th through June 16th, 1974 on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. The purpose of this conference will be to, 1, examine current treaties that are still binding between Indian nations and the United States government. 2, evaluate current findings of the Indian Claims Commission relative to Indian treaties and tribal land illegally taken from them. 3, initiate legislation to halt all proposed and current actions of the Department of Interior and corporate interests regarding the illegal taking of the natural resources of Indian nations and tribes. 4, to determine community and legislative actions to halt all objectionable and questionable policies, acts, programs, or procedures that are violating active treaties or traditional tribal consent. 5, determine the effects of strip mining and gasification programs of the United States Department of Interior as they relate to Indian land. Although AIM and the Sioux Nations are sponsoring the council conference, traditional chiefs and headsmen of all other Indian nations and tribes are being invited to attend. Additionally, U.S. senators and congressmen, attorneys nationally and internationally respected for their expertise on treaty law will also be in attendance. We have requested further that President Nixon attend and talk with Indian tribal members, and he has not responded as of this date. We sent an additional letter to the White House expressing concern that they send somebody before there's nobody left. So, well, you'll notice that we said that to talk with Indian people, not talk to us. The other one is that some of the reasons that we're getting such a tremendous call across this country is because there's virtually very little news about the trial going outside of the Twin City area. And during the last week of the evidentiary hearing to dismiss the charges, it was brought out that a member of the Associated Press, a photographer, had been talking with the FBI and the United States Marshal Service, members of those two law enforcement agencies. And as a result of that, of him being a photographer, and because many of the indictments were based upon photographs taken at Wounded Knee, we felt that members of the Associated Press were working in concert with the law enforcement agencies to push for indictments. And I issued a statement in Boston because my feelings were at that time that this man who was responsible, or who had a very responsible profession, and he was using that profession to gather information and transfer it over to law enforcement agencies for use at the grand jury. And the very thing that Paul Bowe had objected to, him being called to the grand jury in Sioux Falls, was just the opposite of what this guy was doing. This guy was deliberately carrying on communications with the law enforcement officials. And we felt that it really was violating his position. It was violating the feelings that have been established between members of the American Indian Movement and UPI and AP and other members of the news media and the underground press, free press, established media, CBS, ABC, and NBC. I issued a statement in Boston last week that any member of the Associated Press that was found on the American Indian Movement premises were to be forcibly removed. And we've had some time to think about that statement, even though we haven't forcibly removed any of them yet, because they haven't been there. But we've been thinking about that statement, and we've come to a understanding amongst ourselves that so many years ago and throughout history, that a stereotyping of people began because there was one racist bigot who saw an Indian person drinking, and because the alcohol was foreign to his body, he became very, very drunk. And then throughout the years, a lot of stereotyping has been because of one man's observation so many years ago. And then what has happened to Indian people is because the curriculum is based upon feelings that were adopted 50, 100 years ago, and that some of us some people in South Dakota still refer to Indian people as drunken Indians, in other parts of the country also. So I couldn't really allow the American Indian movement to retaliate, with such harsh actions, because it would have an effect on Associated Press members who are very legitimate, who have been working many hours to pump out stories of the Wounded Knee trial, and certainly who have covered other stories in this country that have been positive and productive in nature. And reporters do have a responsible position. The two reporters who pursued the Watergate burglary, had it not been for them, the corruption that is now being revealed in this government may never have come about. So to those responsible photographers and journalists, let that be a lesson to you, that you have to guard your position and your profession so that infiltration does not cause a stereotyping amongst your ranks. And last night or Friday night in Boston and Saturday, I took a position to retract the statement that I made earlier in Boston 2 weeks ago, that I was doing the same thing to an entire profession. I was eliminating them and discriminating them from any activities of news events that may come from the American Indian movement. And part of our job, of course, is to get the story out to the press and to the general community. So if there's anybody from Associated Press here tonight, I'm not going to offer any apologies for the statement that I made 2 weeks ago, but we are lifting the previous announcement that if you come to the American Indian Movement Center, you'll be welcome, and you will not be forcibly removed. You can come and go as you have went before. And with just that explanation that we could not do to you what has been done to us for so many years, simply because of one person. And I don't know how many other informants that the Associated Press may have, or any news media, but they should learn the lesson that a tragedy may have been prevented, by people who decided that, well, we can't throw them all out because of one person. So, and somebody may have been hurt. So we want to get that straight right now, that you're free to come and go. The update on the Wounded Knee trial itself, most of you know that at the last, or not at the last minute, that the trial is going to go on, and most of you have read the ruling by now, which Judge Nichols issued. He did not mention the treaty, and so we have to work harder to do more research so that Judge Nichols, when he does take under advisement again any kind of motion to dismiss, that the 1868 treaty will be a basis for dismissal. It would have been a greater crime if the trial would have been dismissed without reference to the 1868 treaty. It would have been a crime to not only to members of AIM, but it would have been a shame for 3 people to have died for such a great cause. The governmental misconduct continues. But we didn't want the dismissal based upon an illegal wiretap. We have to show and expose to the general public the governmental misconduct that is going on in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The governmental misconduct that takes place on Indian reservations in the Department of Housing, Urban Development, and the misconduct that goes on in health, education, and welfare, the governmental misconduct that is going on in the Bureau of Reclamation, the misconduct in land management, Bureau of Land Management, the misconduct that has taken place on Indian reservations because of illegal actions and policies of the Corps of Engineers. And certainly the misconduct or non-compliance, non-enforcement of the treaties. The governmental misconduct that is taking place now at this very hour, as Secretary of Interior Morton has signed since January 15th the environmental impact study recommending that strip mining began on the Cheyenne and the Arapaho reservations in Wyoming beginning July 1st. The misconduct that has allowed strip mining began on the Crow reservations in Montana that Dr. Paul Bull mentioned. Only then can we honestly accept a dismissal of this trial. We know, and we have known for many years, that there's been misconduct as far as law enforcement goes on the reservation. There's been virtually no law enforcement. I want to add that since January 9th, when the trials began, we began, of course, in December, the first week of December of '73, we began to put together a 3-point program. And most of you have that program or have seen it. It's calling for a treaty commission. It's calling for the repeal of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, and it's calling for the removal of the BIA from the Department of Interior. On December 15th, Senator Abresk introduced into the Senate an American Indian Review Policy Commission, which would deal with the Treaty Commission itself. And I'm happy to announce that since the trial started, and since we have virtually about 9 teams that are covering this United States and speaking, I would say we have covered about 200,000 miles since January. We have visited every state. We have visited Mexico and Canada, and with the help of Chris Spotted Eagle, we have formed an international division to establish support committees in 9 foreign countries to challenge or ask the government to begin enforcement of the treaties, and calling for a worldwide supportive effort behind the 3-point program. Because of the tremendous interest, the American Indian Review Policy Commission is gaining more attention. And although we haven't had any direct contact with Senator Abrist, we're sure that his committee, based upon his aide's information to us, that there has never been as much interest in Indian affairs as there is today. And every senator and every congressman have been receiving letters about how can they help, or what is being done, or where do we go from here, or what are you doing, or what is going on in Congress, what is going on in the House of Representatives, what are governors doing. Never before in the history of the United States, at least the organized United States in a way, has the interest on correcting programs for Indian people been so high as it is today. The work continues. Men like Dr. Paul Bull, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Reverend John Adams from the United Methodist Church, the National Council of Churches, recently under the leadership of Lucius Walker, began a very intensive program to educate all of the denominations of the National Council of Churches towards the three-point program. The work continues not only in the courts here, but this coming Monday or today in South Dakota, the trials against some of our people began in Custer, South Dakota, or as a result of the incident at Custer. They began today in South Dakota. I wanted to, I have to look forward to the Custer cases myself, because I'm personally involved with the cases down there in South Dakota. Most of you already know, but I just wanted to update you on some of the trials going around across the country. That we face 85 years here in federal court here, and following conviction, or if it's thrown out, then we go to South Dakota to take part or take care or finish off or whatever, but go to court in South Dakota, where both Russell and I face. He faces 200, I face 250 years, South Dakota. And if I'm convicted on the burglary charge, it's an automatic life sentence, because it'll mean that if I'm convicted on the other charges, they have what is called a habitual criminal statute. So they're pushing for conviction on any one of the other charges first, and then they're going to push the burglary charge separately. So last. So if I'm convicted on the other 9 first, then they will wait for the burglary charge and push that second. By then I will be a convicted felon and an habitual criminal. And that's the automatic life sentence in South Dakota. After the 250 years and the life sentence, then some of our people go to Scottsbluff, Nebraska, where we face a measly 35 years for disrupting, and they have another charge. It's interfering with state officers during the performance of their legal duties. After the Scottsbluff cases, some of us will have to face trial in Phoenix, Arizona, where after doing the easy 35 in Nebraska, we can do an easy 20 in Arizona. And after doing all the 85 and the life and the 250 and the 35, 20 years, I could do that out of my head. Fairly easy. So about 550 years from now, when I walk through that door with John Poupart, as Paul mentioned, the interest has been tremendous. And I can honestly say that, because of the Associated Press, by the way, them not doing their job, that's why we're flying, that's why there's probably more interest. The people said, we heard about the Wounded Knee incident in 1973, but we don't know about the trials. Are they going on? So we have to explain that I visited the Associated Press Bureau in New York, and I questioned one of the managers down there who explained that the Wounded Knee trials aren't that much of a high interest, according to journalists or people who make the news, people who manage the news. There's not that much interest in the Wounded Knee trials. Everybody, and I want to quote from him, he says, the three biggest stories is the Watergate affair and the Mitchell Stans trial, and the third one was shared, the Hearst kidnapping was shared by streakers. And then the Wounded Knee trials was about 9 or 10. So they have what they call an A wire, that if it's front line or front page story, that goes on A line. If it's second or third page interest or fourth page interest, it goes on the B wire. Well, the Wounded Knee trial is on the G wire. So that, and the Associated Press in New York is of my schedule, and Dr. Paul Bowe's schedule is a job in itself. But the workers, the people that are working for the Why Wounded Knee Committee have really done a tremendous job. There have been other committees that have been formed. There have been people who have held community events. There have been people that, like Debaki, who have held parties at their homes, and in an effort to educate the people in, what's the name of that town, Debaki? Where do you live at? Is it Crystal? Crystal. In an effort to educate people out in Crystal, there have been community events and Mounds View and most of the suburban towns around Minneapolis and St. Paul. But the Why Wounded Knee Committee has done one heck of a job, and I'd really like everybody to show their appreciation right now to Ham Moose and his entire committee who have been working for all of us. There is I want to make another announcement that there is, from May 4th through the 12th of May, the state of Minnesota, or the American Indian Movement and the American Indian Center in St. Paul and Indian groups across Minnesota are going to set aside those 8 days as Minnesota Indian Week, and we'd like some assistance if you could contact, well, I was going to say myself, but if you can contact Donna Oren at the St. Paul American Indian Movement. There's going to be a lot of activities from the 4th through the 12th of May. Everybody's invited to attend any and all of the activities. The 10-state regional AIM conference, everybody's invited to attend that, where we will have a 4-day conference dealing with treaties, dealing with the justice committees and justice departments in the 10-state area. We want clergy, we want people who are interested in coming back with plans for action on how you can organize and how you can help continue to bring about real, constructive, and productive change in the Indian affairs. 4 days, the meetings, of course, are going to be all directed by Indian people. There will be an opportunity for you to speak with Indian people and to meet some of the medicine men. I've asked Dr. Paul Bull to participate there, and you are going to be there, Paul. See, I just forced it out of him right now. But you're all welcome to attend. It's open to non-Indians as well as members of the American Indian Movement. I wanted to add a final, I've had a birth date in the past week. I was going to say I was 37, but I don't know if I'm 42 or 37, depending on who you're listening to. If you're listening to BIA, I'm 37, and which was the best thing that happened so far in this trial is that I become younger. In this trial. I gained 5 years. I shouldn't say that too loudly because Nebraska may want me to do the entire 30 years or 35 without good behavior. So I really appreciate the tremendous interest that has been shown throughout this trial from many Indians and non-Indians. As many of you know, that Indian people are coming here from all parts of the country. People have been here from Mexico. We had a young lady that came from Berlin. I forget which side she was from, but she came here and she presented a petition to Judge Nichols with 2,000 names on it to have the trial dismissed or have the treaties honored. There have been school organizations coming from Rochester, from Wisconsin. There have been Indian groups from Nebraska, Indian study groups. There have been people coming in from North Dakota, Montana. We've had some notables. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando has been up there. We've had certainly an interest from professional people. Attorneys are attending the trial, coming from various counties in the state of Minnesota. We've had professors, law students, and the interest is really high. And we've had some exciting moments in court itself, too. We've had some FBI agents testify. For 4 solid weeks they testified. And, well, some of you can understand the testimony that came from them. It was, where's my attorney at, by the way? I wanted to say something, but I want to make sure I'm within my legal rights. But he's not there. All right, well, I better not say anything. But you know how their testimony is, so. Some interesting things have happened in the trial. Outside the trial, we've been involved in a kidnapping on the West Coast, where just about 2 hours ago they released another tape, and that's another thing too. I really didn't want to get involved in it, but it came about, and however it ends up, I certainly hope that that there's no blood spilled on or any place. So the tape that was just released about 2 hours ago was that the SLA is pretty well contained right now. I guess they suspect that there'll be some busts made on it pretty soon. I have a 10 o'clock flight to catch to Los Angeles, but I want to appreciate it. Thank you. I want to thank everybody that is connected with those of you who are interested, you who are here tonight, and any and all, no matter what color. Our appreciation from the American Indian movement and from both Russell Means and myself. Thank you very much. Questions? I'll take some questions, yeah. If anybody wants to ask any...
We're going to reconnoiter a little bit. You're as long-winded as Paul is. Incredible. When you go around passing out thanks, I think one thing that is impressive to those of us who observe the incredible amount of effort that both Dennis and Russell, with all of the other things that they have to think about, as well as the attorneys, the incredible amount of effort that they have made to try and facilitate some kind of levels of understanding amongst white folk, to try and raise consciousness, the energies that have gone out. We are the ones who stand in great debt for the kind of models that you provide. And the thing that concerns me a little bit is one thing, and we have talked a number of times with a number of people, many of whom are in this room, that we're looking at now the trials resuming again the first part of May. Summertime comes along and people kind of seem to be scattered here and there. And somehow I think those of you who are here, this is not a group of people who are relatively uninformed. I look around and I suspect that every single person who is here has committed themselves one way or another in some way, shape, or form. And I think it's precisely because you are here that efforts are going to have to be sustained over the next months in even greater intensity than they have been in the past. I do not believe that it is possible for funds to be maintained for the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Offense Committee, for AIM, for other kinds of efforts unless somehow we recommit ourselves to the tasks that lie ahead. And particularly over the summertime, I just have some real anxieties about that. Before we throw it back again for questions, maybe we could just have a few housekeeping kinds of things. Yeah.
Before Before Ham stops talking about that, I just want to show you something. Last night I spoke to a church group in Eau Claire, and I mentioned just what you were talking about, the costs of the trial and so on. And after the meeting, a school teacher came up and handed me this check for $100. And she said, I want that to go for the Wounded Knee Defense. Now, that's happening quite frequently all around, and I think that's the kind of thing Ham is talking about that we're going to have.
And lots more of that.
I'll turn it over to Dennis.
Beautiful. I'd like to take this chance to acknowledge a few people, some of whom have really been working their butts off for a number of months, really. What started out as a very kind of casual comment concerning persons when they would say they'd call AIM or they'd call the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Off Committee, what can we do to help? And noting that at times there were as many as 150 to 200 Indian people who were coming in support of the trials at the AIM Center. One thing that happened as a kind of spin-off was a thing called Operation Daily Bread, and it's no big deal, and it is never intended to be any big deal. It merely has been a kind of positive reflection by a number of people who have done some work, who have made a heck of a pile of phone calls, who have talked to people in churches. We did not want the kind of notion that says that you look at issues and you respond to issues by handing out, baskets at Easter time to poor people. But we did feel that there was a way in which maybe on a low-key kind of way, some kind of sustaining support so that persons who were involved at the AIM Center would not have to worry about whether or not there was going to be groceries to kind of feed the people who were coming in and around and in support of the trials, and Operation Daily Bread was a low-key reflection of that. And there are some over 40 parishes and a couple of other clusters that have responded to that. Every other day, I think almost without fail, there has been a response. And Mary Wilson, who's sitting here, raise your hand, Mary, and Mary Ellis Hansen have been two key people in that. And that's got to go on, because the trials are going to go on. And there's a thing Pearl has. Pardon? Okay, John, why don't you pass out those, because there are a couple of names on there. Let's just get them up and down the aisles and note that. Carol, if you want to pass the buckets, and we can start putting some money in those. A couple other things. Dave Johnson, John Helgeson, a number of other people. Eileen Guthrie. Where is Eileen? Over on the side. Joe Badu with the Native Indian Advisory Committee began working on some legislation. Ralph Ware, Dr. Ralph Ware, right here in the state. Dennis has talked about the essential legislative reforms that are needed on a national level. We've got a heck of a pile of legislation that needs doing right here in our state. In addition to that, and some of these folks, together with Nyland and Ruth Lund and a bunch of other people, began to show up over at the legislature, made phone calls to local people, and as a result, for the first time in 25 years, there was a significant piece of Indian legislation, or a piece of legislation that was supported in Indian country right around the state. There are going to be two persons related to the alcohol and drug division of the state. We're going to have an Indian desk there, which is a beginning. And some occasions for dialogue with legislators have been created, and these people have helped to do it. Bud Dixon and a number of people began some work on research, and that is an ongoing process. And when I hear Paul and Dennis refer to the strip mining, I wish that white folks would decide that they would somehow energize. The problem is with some of the big interests of this country. Endicott Peabody, Kennecott Copper, the strip mining, the 3,500 people in Northern Cheyenne, they're not going to make it on their own. There's no way. And I wonder what's to happen on the 1st of July. I think some researching in that whole area would be invaluable. And I know that AIM is doing some research, and maybe somehow there can be a pooling so that the levels at which our consciousness as white folks are raised, as well as direct actions taken. The interaction with congregations. Carol Brusiger, where's Carol? Here. Yeah. Right. Right. Carol Brusiger has been working on that one. Carol Erickson in special events. Bob Evans has been working on some media and other things. A whole line of people, and Dennis has referred to several there. Before we go tonight, we're going to, again, encourage you to utilize the resources in the room next door to try and pick up those kinds of materials that would raise your own consciousness, and basically for white folks to begin to come to grips with some of the realities that the white systems are those things that need changing. Maynard Stanley refers me to a book like this, the opening statements of both Dennis and Russell that have been put out by the Wounded Knee Defense Offense Committee. Tremendously important statements. And for $50 you can read that and show it to others and begin to help others in your own community. One other thing I'd like to refer you to is the newspaper Akwesasne Notes. Tom Cook, who is one of the editors of Akwesasne, hopefully will be back, will be available at the Akwesasne Notes table in there. And we would hope that maybe most of you would begin to subscribe to this and have it come to your own home and get it into the schools and into your church libraries or wherever you can. Okay, one final comment, and that is that I think Dennis has referred to the number of events that are possible for persons to attend over this next month. There are a number of ways in which in our own communities, if we begin to identify more folks, take a look in the newspapers, take a look at those kinds of things that we can encourage others to attend, and thereby widen the number of persons who are aware of a number of the implications of Wounded Knee. Okay, let's move into questions.
The floor is open. Yes, ma'am. Would you use the microphone here, please?
I found out today that for an 8-cent postcard, everybody can stop the hidden grab for Indian lands because there's a bill before the Congress right now that would make local political subdivisions in charge of all leased Indian lands, in spite of what the tribes say. And the Indian groups that are opposing this besides AIM is the Standing Rock Indians and the Governor's Interstate Indian Council in Seattle, Washington. And everybody can take one of these and for 8 cents can write to their congressman.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Dennis has to leave to catch the plane, and if pretty soon. And I think he'd like to entertain questions right at this moment. Anyone now? Let's open it up fast.
Could you give us an update on the appeal that Russell Means made concerning the alleged irregularities and inconsistencies in the voting?
No further update on that, just that the files or the ballots were impounded, and they're still impounded as of this date. And there will be, I believe, July 16th has been set aside as a date for the team of federal investigators to begin looking at the ballots and against the registration. The bill that the young lady just referred to here, I want to say that a lot of people have really flooded the senators and congressmen with demanding that that bill be killed. And Senator Abresk has said that they've received about 40,000 pieces of mail from Indians and non-Indians alike objecting to the passage of that bill. And so it looks like 11748 is effectively dead. But another letter, will really bury it. Because they've been trying for 15 years to get that bill passed. They reword it and they flower it up, and it comes back in another form next year. And the next year after that, it'll come back with somebody else sponsoring it. And this year it was Representative Lujan from New Mexico. But as long as we keep on top of stuff like that, we'll make sure that they never rob another acre of land again.
Anyone else now? Dennis, thanks very much. Thanks very much. Those of you that were at our last meeting, remember that at one point Gladys Bissonnette from the Pine Ridge Reservation came down and spoke to us. Gladys is here again tonight, and I'm going to call on her and ask her if she wouldn't want to say just a few words to us. Would you do that, please?
I'd like to say hello to everybody and good evening. I didn't expect to get up here to speak tonight. I thought I'd come and listen to what Dennis had to say because I'm always behind the pots and pans at the AIM building and I very seldom get out. But I'm keeping in tab of our reservation. I have a cousin, I don't know, some of you might have met her, Ethel Merivale. She's a tribal attorney in Pine Ridge for the AIM people, the full-bloods. She again called me a couple nights ago, and I guess the same old corruption goes on within the reservation. I can't understand why they are trying to lock up some of our boys who are trying to do right and let that corruption go on in Pine Ridge, especially on that Indian reservation where the full-bloods, I always thought they had a right to make up their mind and live the way they want to. But it's not the same today. A couple nights ago, another one of the teachers who is part Indian, not from our reservation, she's from another reservation, was shot by the goons in the abdomen, and she was killed instantly. There's only one witness, eyewitness to that killing. He is hiding out now because he's worried they might get him next. No one can find him if they didn't already put him away and are making believe look for him. These are the things we want to stop. And I can't see why the law or the Justice Department, as they call themselves, let such things go on and still try to hang our boys. But I am all for these boys here. I have a home. I have children back in Pine Ridge. But I am here supporting these boys, and I keep track of what's going on the reservation. They're still beating on full-blood men and boys and even women and girls now in the jail. Several of them have been put in the hospital this past week. And I really don't think that's right. I would just like to see Judge Nickel act as a tribal judge down there in Pine Ridge in the old courthouse there for just about 3 days. I think he'd never want to be a judge again. These are the things we are fighting right now. And these are the things that the BIA and the government holds back. They don't let anyone tell anything about that reservation. They seem to not care. No news ever gets into that reservation and no news ever gets out. But as long as there are people who are now beginning to understand and who are standing up on our reservation, I think we can overcome this kind of corruption. This is why I'm here today. I've never once dreamed I'd be in St. Paul or Minneapolis ever in my life. But this is why I'm here, because the people of this country have to know about this corruption on our reservation. Too many boys and girls who are standing up for justice are taking beatings and getting mowed down like animals. There are a lot of things that I believe in. I have been a Catholic almost all my life. I don't condemn no one's religion, but I have gone back to my traditional religion and I believe in it. This is the only way that I can see people listening to us and coming out to help us, such as you good people here who are in this hall tonight. And I thank each and every one of you. Millions and millions of thanks for supporting us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gladys. You brought, again, a very beautiful moment to us. Now, I'm not in the business of keeping on when there's no point in keeping on, but I do want to provide every opportunity for anyone that does want to talk about anything now with Paul Bow or with Gladys or Ham Moose or anyone else. Do we reach the point where we want to break up for the evening? I do want to extend our most hearty thanks to Augsburg College and to Dr. Oscar Anderson, its president, for allowing us once again the use of the facilities. Thank you very much, Oscar. And thank you one and all for coming here tonight.
On your way out, I'm going to make one announcement that Jerry Roy asked. On the 5th of May, there will be a special rally at South High, 8 o'clock at night. There are some posters in the next room that will help describe that. And thank you for coming.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, welcome to another session of the Judd Forum under the title, The Changing Urban World. A few weeks ago, it was my privilege to hear the president of the University of Cincinnati speaking about the challenge which the city presents to the colleges and universities of this country. I would like to quote his opening paragraph because I think it sets the mood for our concern and involvement as a college of the city. The city and the university are historic cousins. The university was born in the city, in Alexandria's great seat of learning in Egypt, in Salerno, Bologna, Paris, Prague. It was not, as Erich Hofer has written, in the bracing air of steppes or forests that man changed the world. Everything was conceived and realized in the crowded, stinking little cities of Jerusalem, Athens, Florence, Shakespeare's London, Rembrandt's Amsterdam. We will decay, we will decline if we cannot make our cities viable. That's where America's destiny will be decided, in the cities. This urban forum picks up on a theme which the college considered as a community during its centennial celebration 5 years ago, the challenge of the city. New developments, new understandings with respect to the future cause us to pause again to ask about the future as it relates to the cities and the people within them. We feel the need, therefore, to update our understanding of where we are at. And this is why we are extremely grateful to the Judd Foundation for making it possible for us to have this forum, which has been going on all day here at the college, which continues this evening with this keynote address, and which will continue during the bulk of tomorrow. We believe in the city. We believe that we have a part in the city. And this has been reflected in the life of the man whose name is attached to this foundation that has made possible the forum. Dr. Walter Judd served this city as a congressman. He is a man with international vision. He believes in this college and has been a part of it. Therefore, we feel it very appropriate that we could take this splendid grant and share the speakers and the discussions that have been constructed by the committee for this forum. This has been a high point in the life of this college, and I want at this time to say a word of thank you to the committee, and particularly to the two people who chaired the committee, Mrs. Irene Whitney and Dr. Norma Noonan. If they will stand, you can applaud them. It would be pointless for me at this time for this audience to recount all of the accomplishments of our guest speaker. You know him as a great Harvard scholar, as a prolific writer, as a leader in government, as a man who has served his country in the capacity of ambassador, and during the time that we have become acquainted since he came to Minneapolis, we find him to be a great human being. As I say, it is not my purpose to take time tonight to recount his many accomplishments, but simply to say that it is indeed an honor for the Judd Forum, for Augsburg College, and for this community to have in our midst tonight for an address on the metropolis, antecedents as future, Dr. John Kenneth Galbraith of Harvard University. Dr. Galbraith.
President Anderson, my friends, I thank you very much, President Anderson, for that very nice introduction, and say that my feelings are not irretrievably hurt by the fact that you omitted to mention in these evocative surroundings that I was also once a distinguished basketball player, and that I consequently feel very much at home. I may say that these surroundings recall to me what I think perhaps I honestly confess were the unhappiest days of my life. Because of my vast height, it was deemed impossible that I couldn't play basketball, but it turned out to be the case. I was put in never when the game was safely won because the risk was too great. I occasionally got in when the game was irretrievably lost. This had a psychological effect which has warped my personality ever since, has induced an uncertainty and insecurity of manner which you will see manifested throughout the proceedings this evening. So, you will see how badly I felt about that introduction. For people who rightly mistrust spiritual or other subjective insights, like to see or touch what they're talking about, the city is a great thing. It is a tangible expression of modern industrial civilization, or what people rejoice in calling civilization. A number of people making their living outside the boundaries of the city remains the best index of comparative industrial development, and something that is still a matter of very great contrasts in the world. At the beginning of this century, 38%, nearly 40% of the American labor force was still employed in agriculture. By the beginning of the present decade, it was down to 5.2%. In Britain, it was even lower, 3.1%. By contrast, in Italy, the agricultural working force is still around 1/4 of the total. And in India and Pakistan, it's around 70%. And in much of Africa, it is still well above 80%. There are notable metropoli in India and in some other parts of the non-industrialized world. But when one is speaking of the modern industrial city, the modern metropolis, one is speaking of a problem that is peculiar to a relatively small part of the world's population. The rest of the problem, for the rest of the world, the problem of the great city is not a problem so much as it is a set of aspirations. My thought in this lecture this evening is first to engage in a brief effort at classification, to show that the city is not one but several things, and that the modern metropolis is a combination of almost everything that has gone before. Then I propose to trace, none too briefly, the evolution of the several kinds of cities and their coalescence in modern times in the great metropolis. You will have to bear with me, because I'm going to try to see if it's possible to have a setting for this that goes somewhat beyond the borders of our own country, which sees it in its world manifestation. And you will have to bear with me because I'm going to be indulge a certain amount of historical speculation. History can be used to illuminate the present reality, and it can also be used as a device for postponing the time when one has to come to grips with nasty contemporary problems. I have some hopes that my history is of the first sort, but that remains for you to judge. In the end, before you completely lose hope, I want to tell you that I intend also to say something of at least a speculative sort on the future of the modern metropolis and its needs. Although classification is the first step in science, this is something that has lagged where the urban culture is concerned. There are at least 5 distinct types of cities. While some of them had their principal glory in the past, all have a modern counterpart. And along with classification, names are essential, so I'm going to give some names to these various classes: the political household, the merchant city, the industrial city, the camp, and last of all, what I shall call the metropolis, or perhaps more precisely, the polyglot metropolis. To perceive the metropolis, I think we must perceive what has gone before. What I've called the political household has for the most of the time been the extension of the dwelling of a ruler. Like his palace, it was an expression of his taste and personality and a manifestation of the grandeur of his realm. Visitors might speak of the elegance or sometimes of the modesty of the ruler's palace, and they spoke as frequently of the magnificence or, on occasion, the squalor of his capital. Mostly it was the magnificence. Over the centuries, nothing has been so used to enhance royal personality, proficiency in armed slaughter possibly apart, as the architectural embellishment of the seat of government. Rome, Persepolis, Angkor, Constantinople, Paris, Versailles, the Forbidden City, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, once St. Petersburg, Vienna, Segovia, and literally 100 other wonders are the result. My Harvard colleague, the late Joseph Schumpeter, once remarked that each summer tens of thousands of young Americans of the most resolutely democratic instinct set out on pilgrimages to see the monuments to past despotism. A noteworthy thought. The ruler imposed his will and therewith his order on the political household. The order itself was important. Symmetry, even without taste or imagination, has a certain claim upon the eye. Disorder, a point of importance when we come to the industrial city, has no claim. But also, and more often than might have been imagined, there was a conjunction between power and imagination and taste. One of the most remarkable results of that combination has been kept intact for 400 years. Not only has it survived, but it is unsullied. Unlike Leningrad or Florence or Paris, there is no commercial or industrial overlay with which the visitor must contend, through which he must peer, or through which he must pick his way. The city, the archetype of the royal political household, is fata per secre. What one writer has recently called, I think correctly, the world's most perfectly preserved ghost town. It's worth maybe a word. This city was built by Akbar the Great on a low rocky ridge about 24 miles from another inspired capital, that of Agra. The legend, more trustworthy than most, is that the site was chosen there because there lived in the village a holy man, showing that even in those days people were subject to the seductions of Indian holy men, called Sheikh Salim Christi, a man I suspect to be more reputable than the modern gurus. Akbar, in spite of the near infinity of his wives, had some difficulty producing a son. And so he went to see Sheikh Salim, and son was forthcoming, as you might expect. And in great gratitude, Akbar queried the ridge there, made a lake some 20 miles around, and built a new capital. And visitors coming from Europe in the next few years found a city that was larger than London and infinitely more elegant. And then, after occupying the city for 14 years, Akbar moved on. There are various solemn explanations for this: failure of the water supply, or the suggestion that it was a strategically unsatisfactory location. These explanations are both wrong. They overlook the most plausible reason, which was that the Mughals, reflecting perhaps their Asian antecedents, were notoriously peripatetic. And after a little while, they got tired of a city and just went on. When Akbar left, so did the people. Most of the private dwellings, which one supposes were not as orderly as they might have been, fell down or otherwise disappeared. And the walls and the mosque, the mint, the treasury, the caravansary, and the palaces remained. And no commerce and no industry has ever since come. And the palaces on the walls, cut and assembled as though the stone were timber, have remained in the clean, dry air ever since. They've mellowed, but they have not decayed. There one sees in its most exact form the nature, the marvelous symmetry, and the great beauty of the political household. One also sees the most enigmatic of all quotations over the great gate. The world is a bridge. Pass over it, but do not build upon it. This is a marvelously enigmatic thing because you can read any conceivable interpretation into it that you wish. The political households are mostly of the past. However, with the merchant city, it remains to this day our image of what the city should be like. It also has a certain modern prototype, because from the old royal household has come the notion that government has a special claim to architectural grandeur. Industrialists are expected to work, even though they are not themselves expected to live, in very sordid cities. Their offices may be tall, but the offices must be functional. Politicians and bureaucrats, however, are believed to require somewhat more refined surroundings. Their cities should be planned, their buildings should be embellished, however badly, as were the royal palaces. And what rejoices the eye must to this day be nicely balanced against what distresses the taxpayer. And it's from this nice calculation that has come the modern capitals: Washington, New Delhi, Canberra, Brasilia, and Islamabad. Cities that have all been built more or less in accordance with the ruling conception and design. And it is worth a thought that these are the few strictly modern cities that the modern tourist thinks it's worth his while to visit, along, of course, with the skyways here in Minneapolis. Skywalks, I'm sorry. The merchant city, my second type, had also a unity of conception and design. This may have been the result less of central authority than of unity of group taste. Merchants must be sensitive to fashion, and at any time in architecture, as in dress or crime, there is a ruling style. Also, the merchant communities, in the age of high mercantilism, had a strong sense of their collective and even monopolistic interest. This led to meticulous regulation of the terms and conditions of trade and of the antecedent manufacture, and regulation extended naturally to the plan of the towns, the design of the houses. Within this larger framework, then, there was a rewarding competition. Quality and style in the house suggested quality and style in the merchandise that was available within the house. And in consequence, the merchant cities, Venice, Genoa, the Hansa towns, or those of them that survived the bombers of World War II, they rival in order and elegance the great political households. And they are the other cities, and almost the only other cities, that tourists go to visit. The supreme expression of the older political households were the palaces of the ruler. In the merchant city, along with the merchant palaces, there was the guild hall, the town hall, and, of course, the cathedral, which advertised, legitimatized, and in some measure sanctified the profits from trade. These buildings, accordingly, were the most important. There are two great merchant cities that survive, as does Fata-Persikri, with little modern clutter. The greatest, of course, is Venice, which is the grandest of all museums of civic design. The other, which is less known, but much more easily encompassed by the eye, is Bruges. It was a member of the Hanseatic League, which was also a source of common ideas as to design. And in the 14th century, actually, Bruges was regarded as the northern counterpart of Venice itself. It remains intact to this day because of two quite extraordinary accidents. The silting up of the river Zwin, which separated it for 400 years from the sea, and thus from the ravages of economic development, and a totally inexplicable accident, which in the years from 1914 to 1918 left it a mere 20 miles behind, but totally untouched by the bloodiest and most brutal and most devastating battles of all time, battles along the Western Front. The merchant city also, like Canberra, Washington, and Delhi, survives in modern times. Its modern relationship is less to the sea and to ships than it is to agriculture. It's the place in Iowa or southern Minnesota to which farmers now repair for fertilizer, farm machinery, building materials, clothing, and even the education of their young. Its most ubiquitous mercantile establishment is the automobile service station. But the merchants still live in the largest houses back from the road and behind a lawn. If there is now an aspect of shabby impermanence about their residences or these retreats, the paint is flaking a bit, shutters are a bit loose, the leaves are unraked, it is because the merchants are now civil servants, the current managers of J.C. Penney, Sears Roebuck, and Western Automobile Supply. And one day soon, they will be moved along. So the modern merchant city, though it exists, is in all respects a trivial reminder of its great precursors, and to the best of my knowledge, there is none that any tourist goes to see. With the Industrial Revolution, the industrial city became synonymous with the word city. And in consequence, with the Industrial Revolution, the very connotation of the word city changed. Before 1776, the word city had an overtone of grandeur, we should remind ourselves. You all remember that Dick Whittington's first glimpse of London was a glimpse as of the promised land. And Dr. Johnson held that anyone who was tired of that city was tired of life itself. Thereafter, slowly but certainly, a reference to a city became a reference to something not grand, not diverse, but rather dirty. Because the industrial city was the characteristic city, all cities came to be thought somewhat squalid. There was much about the industrial city which assured this reputation. The political household housed courtiers, courtesans, retainers, civil servants, soldiers, and servants. In the merchant cities, there were clerks, petty officials, and tradesmen. In both of the pre-industrial cities, there were craftsmen, artisans, small shopkeepers, and an abundance of mendicants. But with the notable exception of the mendicants, those who lived in these cities were rather presentable. They had to be minimally decent because they served people of professed gentility who would be repelled by unduly crude appearance or manner. A pleasing variety in dress, speech, style, and color was associated with the different arts and skills. The industrial city, by contrast, made no such demands on its people. People in the industrial city were now a utility, a servo mechanism. Their service was not diminished by their being shabby, unwashed, rough of manner, and ripe of smell. On the whole, these characteristics were approved, for they minimized cost, and in the industrial city, men sought not elegance, but lowest cost. The reasons, incidentally, were not entirely to be deplored. The industrial city, unlike its predecessors, produced cheaply for customers who were also poor. The people of the industrial city, as I say, were not beautiful, nor were their dwellings, nor a commonplace point were the processes by which the goods were made. These, in practice, all but uniformly involved smoke or grime. Coal had to be dug, ore had to be smelted, locomotives had to be fired, steam engines had to be fueled, even for processes that were otherwise clean. All these operations spread filth. Amidst the modern concern over the effect of industrial expansion on our surroundings, on the environment, concern which I must say I applaud, it is not always remembered that the course of industrial progress has been, at least until very recently, a remarkably steady march from the foul process to the relatively pure, from dirty coal to clean gas, or clean oil and electricity, from smoke-filled foundries to air-conditioned control rooms, from belching steam engines to the much cleaner internal combustion engine and the wholly antiseptic electric motor. We still take it for granted that the older the industrial community or the more obsolescent the factory therein, the dirtier it all will be. Early industrial processes rightly established the reputation of the industrial city as a nasty place. Finally, among the constants of the industrial city were the industrialists. While a merchant had to be a man of style and taste, this was not true of a manufacturer. His concern was methods and machines and costs. For coal, steel, chemicals, machinery, the buyer was concerned only with performance and cost. And the early consumer products of the industrial city, cloth and more cloth and Macefield's famous cheap tin trays, made no demands on taste. So the early manufacturer was like his product, solid, efficient, graceless, or not positively crude. He built his house up on the hills above the mills, and unlike the merchant's house, it was assumed that it would be ungainly where it was not hideous. Economics, we must always remind ourselves, strongly forces its character even on art. Not that all industrial cities were alike. The leading industrialist always impressed himself strongly upon the life of the city, and sometimes to its advantage. When he retired in 1876 as the world's most eminent manufacturer of screws, Joseph Chamberlain became 3 times the mayor of Birmingham, England. And there followed in that particular industrial city a remarkable burst of civic pride. Libraries were built, theater established, museums, so forth. In this respect, however, Birmingham, England, was probably an exception. Its namesake here in Alabama was closer to the rule. By the beginning of the present century, it was on its way to becoming the leading industrial city of the South. Coal, iron ore, and limestone were all there in close proximity. These were brought together by the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, which in 1907 was brought by J.P. Morgan into the United States Steel Corporation. The more typical case of Birmingham, Alabama, was one of absentee management, in the case of Birmingham, twice removed. The Steel Corporation was operated for Morgan by Albert Henry Gary, and Gary's biographer, Benjamin Stolberg, observes that Judge Gary never saw a blast furnace until after his death. The second Birmingham, in other words, was merely a place of work. Until the 1920s, as elsewhere in the American steel industry, men there worked a 12-hour day and a 7-day week. And Christmas was another day of toil. The Alabama Birmingham still, like most industrial cities, bears the mark of its industrial origins. Until very recent times, as you know, its principal expression of civic pride was its firm resistance to racial integration. Now, this has given way to football. In one variant of the industrial city, the industrialist took full responsibility for inception, design, and administration. He laid out streets, built and owned the houses, built and operated the stores, or the store where people shopped, and sometimes were required to shop. And he laid on water supply and sewage, if there were any. This, like the cities of the princes, was an imposed order, an industrial household. It wasn't designed for grandeur, but for economy, and to ensure that the inmates, however sullen, would not be mutinous. Workers were deemed to be less refractory if they were permanently in debt to their employer and could be expelled on demand from their houses. Not infrequently, innocents were taken to see these towns and had a favorable impression also of the symmetry of design that they manifested. But it also seems possible that there was never an experiment that was so completely rejected by everybody associated with it as the company town. Even where the employer landlord was publicly celebrated as a Christian idealist, as in the case of George Pullman, he was, in moments of high ceremony, often hung in effigy by people who deeply deplored the need to use symbolism. The normal industrial city was of the classical liberal ethic. There was a semblance of city government on a loose leash from the local capitalist. Since this added to living costs and ultimately to the diminution of profits or the enhancement of production costs, urban services were naturally kept at the minimum. The filth of the industry was mingled with the offal of the inhabitants. Since the factories required only an unlettered proletariat, that, in general, was what the schools provided. Again, we see the imprint of economics on the culture. The industrial city in Europe in the last century was probably better served by its government than in the United States. Those who were elected or appointed to office were often, and perhaps in Europe usually, non-larcenous. In the United States, where men were measured in straightforward fashion by the money they made, the city officials responded to the dominant ethic by making money for themselves. In 1888, Lord Bryce, after his famous survey of the government of the United States, concluded, quotes, that the government of the cities of the United States is the one conspicuous failure of that country. And 2 decades later, Lincoln Steffens, about whom there has just been a marvelous biography by Justin Kaplan, said, and who was then the dean of American muckrakers, one of the founders of what has since become a famous industry, Steffens told, at what I have always privately thought was appalling length, of the evil association of reputable economic power and disreputable political power in the American metropolis. Probably he shouldn't have been surprised. The city that so distressed these observers corresponded not at all badly to industrial need. The industrialist was free from restraint. He could do as he needed with air, water, and landscape. And for the rest, it was an efficient place for the shelter of the cattle at the lowest possible cost. Given that the purpose of the city was to produce goods in maximum quantity at minimum cost, not much more was to be asked. Certainly not much more was asked. As the visible face of the industrial civilization in the leading industrial countries, the United States, Britain, Germany, the industrial city had its sharpest delineation around the beginning of the present century. Pittsburgh, Sheffield, Essen were its purest form. Since then, in the older industrial countries, the image has again blurred. A new city, the camp, has been spawned. And this and change have melded the industrial city into my yet further and final type, the polyglot metropolis. The most important influence for change has been money, rising real income. This is reflected in the dwellings, but even more in the shops, shopping centers, cinemas, and stadia where incomes are spent. The social power of money is great for the rich, but also for the less rich too. There is also in this city a much enhanced professional class: doctors, lawyers, accountants, civil servants. Also too, a new race of artisans who are surgeons to automobiles, plumbing, television sets, and washing machines. And the industrial firm itself is no longer an owner, a few bookkeepers, a few foremen, and a large toiling mass. Instead, there is a complex superstructure, sales managers, advertising managers, controllers, and those who know about the computer. With the bankers, law firms, advertising agencies, and public relations flacks who serve the industrial establishment, these comprise a large new layer between blue-collar workers and owners. So also do the white-collar workers, who in the industrial nations now far outnumber the blue-collar workers who serve the machines. The servo-proletariat of the industrial city has also itself changed with rising income. And as it has changed, it has been submerged in the new artisan, technical, professional, and managerial class. From the earliest days of the industrial city, there was a strong desire by the few who could afford it to escape its smoke and grime, and even more, its unlovely landscape. So with the industrial city came the suburb. With the reconstitution of a mercantile class and the appearance of the new managerial elite, which I have just mentioned, the growth of the suburbs gained greatly in momentum. Here the rich or the modestly affluent could live in comparatively clean air with their private trees and private grass. And they could have schools and churches and recreational facilities of superior quality, the quality ensured and the cost kept down by their not having to be shared with the poor. In time, every sizable city was surrounded by these enclaves. Unlike the political household, the merchant city, or the industrial city itself, these settlements had no central function. They did not rule, sell, or mate. They were places merely where people found space. Often given the peripatetic character of the modern organization man, this space they occupied only for a brief time. In the absence of central function, in the impermanence of its residents, the modern suburb is less a city than a bivouac. We may think of the modern large industrial city as being surrounded then by a yet further kind of city, which we shall call the camp. This is interesting that in the United States, we have, in consequence, a yet further Birmingham, which is a refuge of the affluent General Motors executives from Detroit. Within the old industrial city, the old working force has not only changed, but a most important point, it has also been stratified. The city always grew, procreation apart, in response to two forces. One was the attraction of the wages of its mills, however dark and satanic they might be. The second was because people were being expelled from their previous place of livelihood and had nowhere else to go. The industrial cities of the late 18th century in Britain attracted workers with a wage which, however low, was better than could be had in agriculture. However idyllic Goldsmith's Auburn was, we can be sure that Auburn was a very low-wage place. And simultaneously, the Acts of Enclosure, and in Scotland, the clearances, which had the distinguished consequence of sending my ancestors to Canada, the reason that they later improved to the search for liberty, liquidated even the alternative of agriculture. As Mantoux says, industry was in fact the only refuge for thousands of men who found themselves cut off from their traditional occupation. And he also tells in his famous history of the Industrial Revolution, he quotes a marvelous petition sent in the latter part of the 18th century from a village in which the workers complained of their lot, saying that they, and here I quote because the prose is simply marvelous, they say that the people of the village were being driven from necessity and want of employ in vast crowds into manufacturing towns, where the very nature of their employment over the loom or forge may waste their strength and consequently debilitate their posterity. I submit to you, President Anderson, that there's no place in the Lutheran Church where one any longer has language of that quality, and that here at Augsburg you should do something about it. English agriculture was substituting the greater intelligence, energy, and economics of the large-scale farmer for the inefficient, labor-intensive husbandry of those who worked small plots and shared the common land. 75 years later, much of the population of Ireland was expelled to the industrial cities and also to the mines and the railway camps of the United States, and again by agricultural change. This time, of course, the sudden devastating failure of the potato crop on which all Irishmen were fed. Some things do not change. In the years following World War II, cities in Western Europe, Britain, and the United States were again transformed by the same forces that changed Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. From the villages of Germany, France, the agricultural villages of Germany, France, and the Low Countries, men and women were drawn to the cities by the higher industrial wages. And they were also expelled by the mechanization of agriculture. And workers were drawn from beyond the borders of these countries, from Yugoslavia, southern Italy, Algeria, Spain, Anatolia, by the attraction of wages. In all of these countries, agricultural change was also making men obsolete in agriculture and forcing them to look to the cities for alternatives. People have similarly been forced into the industrial cities. In the case of Britain, the divestiture of empire came at, which is regarded by everybody as an unprecedented act of political self-denial, came at exactly the moment in history when otherwise Britain would have been engulfed by the forced migration or the people who were drawn to Britain from the erstwhile empire. This made it possible for the 19th century race of British politicians to make their political fame by defending the empire, and their sons to make their political reputation defending the homeland from the invasion of the erstwhile dark colonialists. It is a commonplace that history is a thing of paradox. We should also notice that from time to time it has a sense of humor. But the less visible, but much greater migration occurred here in the United States. Some of this, of course, was the result of the peculiar character of our colonialism. We retained association with Puerto Rico, which, except for the Philippines, was our most populous dependency. In consequence, as was not true in Britain, and was only to a limited extent true in France, our colonial subjects were able to move en masse to the erstwhile imperial center, as they could not do so in the older empires. That accounts for the conversion of New York, as well as also other cities on the eastern seaboard, to substantially Puerto Rican centers, with very substantial areas to Puerto Rican centers. But in the United States, in our case, agricultural change was especially ruthless in making agricultural manpower obsolete. The greatest of agricultural revolutions of all time struck the Cotton South, and in the old Confederacy, cotton gave way to cattle, pine trees, and forthright farm abandonment. And elsewhere, the methods of cotton culture, hand hoeing or chopping, hand picking, unchanged more or less for 100 years, even 2 centuries for that matter, within almost a decade became obsolete as the result of chemicals, flame cultivators, and the mechanical cotton picker. So, as elsewhere, the people had to get out. Most moved to the industrial cities of the north. And like the erstwhile subjects of the Queen in Britain, most, although by no means all of them, were dark. In Britain, prior to the arrival of the Indians and the Pakistanis and the West Indians, color xenophobia had been thought to be an American disorder. In the northern states, prior to the arrival of the new migrants from the south, it had been thought to be a peculiar southern affliction. Now we found these xenophobic tendencies to be pandemic. With the arrival of the new waves of immigrants, the city underwent its most recent change. Previously, the nature of its internal tensions had been assumed. The workers confronted the capitalist. The strike was the overt manifestation of this conflict. The people in the valley went into the streets in angry opposition to the employer on the hill and his, I was going to say handmaidens, there's something wrong here, and his handmaidens in the police. It's an excessively modern form. After weeks, sometimes months of struggle, sometimes with violence, always with deprivation, one side or the other side gave in. Work was then resumed, and the anger persisted. With the rise of the new managerial class, negotiations with workers now passed from owners to organization men. The organization man could be blamed for strikes, but he didn't pay the higher wages that were the cost of the settlement. This not having to pay makes a great difference. The modern industrial firm was also powerful in its markets, so that it could pass the cost of settlements on to the public. And so it came about that in all of the industrial cities, after some ceremonial acrimony, strikes were settled with higher wage costs passed on in the form of higher prices. Strikes still occurred, but they were largely without rancor, and sometimes they had the effect of usefully reducing business inventories. But meanwhile, a new conflict replaced the old one. We can't do without conflict. This is between the two proletariats of the industrial city, between the old, established, relatively secure, relatively well-paid working force, and the new, often dark tide, which it perceived as being, both socially and economically, its enemy or its nemesis. Suspicion and dislike were, as so often before, facilitated by differences in color, language, or ethnic origin. For the new sub-proletariat, in consequence, the capitalist was no longer the enemy. Many who cleaned the streets, tended buildings, labored without skill on construction sites, or were unemployed, wished they had industrial employment. And they wished they had housing and schools and transportation. And as they wished they lived in a society that was decently colorblind. Their enemy, in other words, was no longer the capitalist, but was the social order. When they revolted, they didn't yearn to burn the capitalist or hang him in effigy. They were, at least on occasion, tempted to burn the city. The mellowing of the industrial city by affluence, the appearance of the surrounding camps, the effect of the new immigrants, all combine to identify yet another type of city. This unites or draws on all that has gone before. Perhaps it might be called the post-industrial city. More accurately, I think it can be called, as I indicated at the outset, the polyglot metropolis. Industry in this city is still a major raison d'etre. But the old class structure of the industrial city, as we have seen, has ceased to exist. So have the physical lineaments of the factory town. Affluence has brought the shops and shopping centers and the ancillary services that are in descent from those of the merchant city. Around about and forming part of the polyglot metropolis, and sometimes rendering its center subject to a measure of mercantile decay, are the camps. And in the greatest of these metropoli, Rome, Paris, London, Tokyo, and New York with the United Nations, there remain the political enclaves. The polyglot metropolis is, in other words, something of all that has gone before. Let me venture now a few thoughts on what lies ahead for this latest and most complex type of city. And let me also venture a few thoughts on what I think should lie ahead if we make it happen. The assimilation of the new arrivals, which has been our greatest preoccupation, will, I think, be the easiest of the problems of the modern metropolis. The scale of this movement has been very large in modern times. It will be very much smaller in the future. In the United States, we can only liquidate our agricultural working force once. We can't do it again. And a great deal, it seems to me, has been attributed to race that is really attributable to the very low level of economic existence of the rural working force that came to the cities. Let us recall that in the 1930s, the movement of a very poor agricultural population into California, the Okies and the Arkies, of Oklahoma and the Southwest was the source of a great deal of social tension and the source of one of our most notable novels, John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. The next generation of new urban dwellers, under any circumstances, will have higher educational and economic aspirations than did the first migrants, their parents. These aspirations, some at least, will achieve. When this happens, the problems of race and color will diminish and may even seem archaic. We must always remind ourselves very hard for the poor or the rich and the poor of the same language and race to live side by side. But the moderately affluent of different races have no problem anywhere of living together. I venture the thought, this is not a prediction, that the more plausible problem of the city of 20 or 30 years ago will be how to arrange a new migration from some new rural area so that the present urban dwellers, as they have moved up the ladder, will be able to find someone else to do the nasty jobs that they will have left behind. As the acculturation of the recent rural migrants proceeds, we should expect, I would think, a return of population from the camps to the central city. Marx spoke accurately, if untactfully, of the idiocy of rural life. And in his introductory remarks this evening, I must point out that the president of this college was also in the same tradition. I hesitate to call him a Marxist. The same, but more, could be said of much suburban life. Grass is not a substitute for cultural amenity. The suburban movement was the response of the older city dwellers to the poverty and indiscipline of the new arrivals. As the shock effect wears off, the superior quality of city life will, I venture to think, naturally reassert itself. Two other matters, it seemed to me, are far more serious. There is first the fact that capitalism is seriously incompetent in providing the things and services that cities most require. And it is quite competent in providing those things that cause problems for the city. Capitalism has never in any country been efficient for building houses at moderate costs, which it seems to me unnecessary to stress are a rather important urban convenience. Nor does capitalism provide good health services, something that also acquires enhanced importance when people live closely juxtaposed with attendant health risks, and what is more important, perhaps, when they no longer accept as inevitable sickness and a quiet death in some lonesome hired worker's cottage or some sharecropper's cabin. Nor does capitalism provide efficient transportation for people, something that also makes vital the life of the metropolis. In Western Europe and Japan, as also needless to say in the communist countries, these failures of capitalism are at least partly accepted, although they are still regarded as adventitious rather than inherent. In the United States, while we apply bandages to these urban sores of housing, health care, transportation, we have never accepted them as inherent, as inevitable. I think that perhaps the most urgent need for improved urban existence is to accept that the modern city is, by its very nature, a social, I hesitate, but I'm willing to say it, a socialist enterprise. Without a large area of successful socialism, urban life will be defective in the most immediate essentials: housing, health care, transportation. But this necessity is related to a yet further requirement. That is to see far more clearly than we do at present the essentially social character of the city as a whole. We have seen that the city in its days of greatest elegance was a household, an extension of the domestic arrangements of the ruler. No line then separated the private from the public domain. It seems likely that what would now be regarded as public tasks absorbed a major share of the total public and private income. We now take for granted that the performance of the public tasks of the city, education, police protection, courts, sanitation, recreation, public entertainment, care of the old and the impoverished, should be only a subtraction from the real income on which, no one doubts, the private household has the major claim. The consequences of this we can all recognize. Among the affluent, and even to some extent among the poor, services supplied out of private income are far more amply endowed than those that are provided by the city. We have clean houses in most cities and filthy streets. Personal wealth expands, but in most cities there are too few police officers to protect it. Television sets are omnipresent, but schools are deficient. Not every community can have Henry Wolf as a substitute for an educational system. Bathing is possible in a private bathroom, but not at a public beach. The areas of production where capitalism is efficient, by contrast, add to the costs of the city, to the automobiles that must be accommodated in and through the city, to the detritus that must be picked up from the streets, to the problem of keeping breathable the air, and to the task of sustaining a minimum tranquility of life. This is another way of saying that the social aspect of modern city life is extremely expensive, far more expensive than we have yet envisaged. The notion that these social costs are a modest deduction from total expenditure is a legacy of attitudes formed out of the industrial city, and it is now obsolete. Conceivably in the future, if the city is to be healthy, pleasant, otherwise agreeable, and culturally and intellectually rewarding, public expenditures will have to be higher in the aggregate than private expenditures. No arbitrary conclusion can be reached on this point. But however this may be, the concept of a civic household will have to be recaptured. As with a household, the choice is between different benefits at the margin with no a priori case for one type of expenditure or another, and no a priori case for the higher urgency of private as opposed to public outlays. I hasten to say this is not a matter of ideological preference. I didn't invent the city. It is a circumstance given by the intensely social nature of the modern metropolis, and nobody, no matter how conservative, is going to escape from that social character. The acceptance of the social character of the metropolis involves more than questions of bread and butter, of housing, health care, clean streets, and safe parks. It also involves yet another dimension, that of art and design. And this, you will be happy to know, is my last point. People, I earlier pointed out, travel by the millions each season to view the elegant political households of the past. And some go to see the Washington of the present. They do not visit, even in their present and improved manifestations, any of the three Birminghams. The difference is elementary. The political households were or are social entities. The cities which people forswear carry the aesthetic legacy of classical liberal capitalism. There is no proof that people were more sensitive to artistic need in the days of Dresden or St. Petersburg than in the age of Pittsburgh or Dusseldorf. But Dresden and St. Petersburg were faithful to a central conception, a common style. It was enforced as the architect enforces a common conception for a whole house. This concept can be good or bad, but one rule can be laid down as final. Whether good or bad, it will be better than when there is no governing order at all. As a legacy of classical liberalism, there is, one suspects, a special unwillingness to socialize design, to specify overall architectural styles to which the subordinate units must conform. There is no place where the entry of a social, as distinct from an industrial expression, is more urgent. I must say that, like many other people, I see the key to this extensively as lying in the control of land. I continue to be puzzled as to why my people of generally, as we call it in the United States, liberal political faith, when we gather to celebrate our faith, give so little attention to the public ownership of urban land. There's no other form of property for which the case for public ownership is so strong. It is this, in the language of the British Labour Party, is the commanding height on which it seems to me, more than anything else, the quality of future urban development depends. Those among you with patience, an instinct for survival, will have sensed by now that the view of the future of the metropolis that I have just offered is tendentious. It is an outline, perhaps not of what will happen, but what I think should happen. This, I would suggest to you, is wholly consistent. Liberal capitalist attitudes saw the future not as something that one might predict, but not as something one might control. In the social view of the city, by contrast, it is basic to the social ethic that the future design, the future shape of things, is what the society, what people decide it should be. I must tell you, again, that how pleased I am to be here, and how much I'm grateful to you for your attention, and how much better you are as I look over your smiling, eager faces than the average basketball crowd. Thank you.
I'm sure, Dr. Galbraith, that this response from this audience indicates how deeply we appreciate the wonderful overview that you have given us and how much we feel indebted to you for intensifying our understanding of something that is of concern to all of us. You will be happy to know that if you do go across Murphy Square to the College Center, where there will be a reception for Dr. and Mrs. Galbraith, he will be happy to answer some of your questions as the time permits. Thank you once more. We're honored by your presence. I would like now to ask you to listen to a few announcements from one of the capable chairpersons of our committee, Dr. Norma Noonan, as she tells you what is in store for us as we continue this forum. Dr. Noonan.